A warm greeting to all of you. I'm very pleased that so many of you have been able to join us for this session. As I say, I should have first said it's Sue McKenna speaking from Rhodes University, and I head up the EQPE project with Stephanie Burton, who's also on the call. And this session is co-hosted between the EQPE project and the EDE project, which is an EU-funded project, and Colette Gerards is on the call.
Sue, we've lost you.
Works. And if by chance I lose connection and lose signal, I'm very grateful to Colette for agreeing to simply take over from me. One of the in the Enhancing Doctoral Education program project is Nene. Dr. Nene, who's going to be chatting to us today, is the Director of Standards and Capacity Development at the Council on Higher Education, where he's actually been in various positions since 2016. And he's the coordinator for the implementation of the Quality Assurance Framework, and has been involved, as I'm sure you saw on the bio and invitation, he's been involved in all sorts of national structures, including higher education and its relationship with various occupation and trade sectors. Political UKZN, and he's interested in public participation, democratic governance. And today we are going to be talking about the idea of an African-wide qualifications framework. Now, any of you who are familiar with my writing know that I am always a little bit skeptical about the role of qualifications frameworks and the extent to which they can at times bureaucratize and overgeneralize the idea of what quality means and fail to take nuance of different contexts into account. On the other hand, as we've seen from the European experience, they do allow far greater mobility between countries and an opportunity for different countries to have some kind of solidarity in its higher education sector, which for Africa is particularly important at the moment. So I'm certainly looking forward to hearing what Nene has to share with us as he tells us about the progress being made towards a continental-wide qualifications framework for higher education. Thank you so much for joining us, Nene, and for once again offering to share your insights from your perspective, which I think you have got a much more, what can I say, wide-angled lens or helicopter view on the situation than perhaps many of us as academics within universities. So we really look forward to hearing from you. And with that, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sue. Colleagues, I hope you can hear me this afternoon. May I just ask for confirmation, please?
Hear you very well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I know Prof. McKenna is driving. Just out of respect, I'm just going to show my ugly face once and then switch my camera off, just so that you know that it's not AI talking. And then we'll proceed with the discussions. Colleagues, that's the face you don't want to see, but at least you know that it is a real person. Thank you very much, colleagues. Thank you for inviting me to this engagement. When I was invited, I immediately agreed to it. But then later I said, oh God, what did I do? What have I just done? Because this is a complex subject for which I am not an expert. But it's something that I think is very valuable to us as a sector. And my presentation today is not an expert presentation. We can organize one with an expert in the field who was actually part of the process from beginning until its conclusion. It's not concluded yet, but until the stage where you would say you have an African Continental Qualifications Framework. But I think it is essential for us to look at what I'm about to present from the point of view of what is currently in place and what we would be able to then put together as a system, and how we as a system should be able to respond. I'm trying to share my screen. I am not sure if it's visible on your side. Just give me a moment, colleagues. Just my settings are giving me challenges. Okay, thank you. Let me try again. Otherwise, I may ask for some assistance with sharing of my screen if it becomes a problem. There you go.
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, colleagues. Let me then get to it. So today we're going to have a bit of a discussion on the African Continental Qualifications Framework. As I said, I'm not in any way an expert on this. It's a relatively new conversation for some of us, but one that I think is shaping the sector in ways that we haven't begun to really truly appreciate, at least in this country. And you will see why perhaps in this country it may not be something that we're discussing as much as it discussed in other countries. And those of us who are familiar with the NQF, the National Qualifications Framework, you would then see that maybe this discussion, important as it might be, it's not introducing you to anything fundamentally new, because of how the ACQF has been developed over the years. But let's see how we then get on. I want to start with the importance of the history of the development of the ACQF. The its foundation is the African Union. It is a continental instrument that has expression from the African Union and from different strategies and different policy documents of the African Union, namely the Continental Education Strategy for Africa, which provides for specific requirements of the development of a national qualifications framework and regional qualifications framework to create and facilitate the creation of multiple pathways for the learners on the continent, particularly on the continent, so that you can look at issues of acquisition of skills, the transfer of those skills, the mobility of students from one system to the other, and the balance between the national frameworks, the regional qualifications frameworks, as well as the continental one. It's not included in the slide, but I think it's worth mentioning that the development of this instrument was also funded, and this is a point I think many of us are going to either have an issue with or appreciate. It's an important one. It was funded through European partners, having looked at the European standards and guidelines and the European instruments, as well as the African standards and guidelines and those African standards and instruments across the globe as well. Some other instruments were considered. So it's not an instrument that was simply done by Africans, only by Africans for Africans. There is an element of influence from the point of view of funding, but also from the point of view of benchmarking and what is best practice across the world. I'm saying this because already you would have heard Prof. McKenna raise some concerns around the bureaucratization of national qualifications frameworks and the politicization perhaps of these instruments and how they affect quality and how quality is considered in different settings and in different systems. But it's important to know that it's a benchmark, it's a globally benchmarked and a European funded instrument. It is, of course, owned. At least I would like to believe that it is owned by Africans themselves. The purpose of the instruments, the ACQF, there are four main purposes here. One is to enhance compatibility quality and transparency of the qualification of all types across the system. Those of us who work with students registration, student supervision, particularly at a postgraduate level, you realize that there are challenges that are faced in some systems, particularly with some regions in the continent, by students from those regions who come to the South African system or the Kenyan system, who might not automatically have their qualifications recognized for them to then go on study further education, or at least postgraduate education. That is because the qualifications are not considered to be on par, at least in terms of the NQF, with those that they're seeking to really enter, or those that they've studied. It could be the question of language in some instances, where you must do a language to improve either your English or whatever the case may be. This affects largely students from formerly in Francophone countries. I know we no longer use that term, and please forgive me for using it now. I just wanted to make the point. And in some instances, you would require students to do an additional something, additional course, an additional program for them to then be able to access the program that they intend to access. It is a problem, because when we speak of mobility of students across the African continent, it works in some instances and it doesn't work. And you find that students who have largely studied in advanced systems or mature systems on the continent do not face similar problems when they go into other systems in the continent. So there is a lack of parity of esteem of the qualifications that ultimately should be similar qualifications, which creates challenges for skills mobility, for transference, and all those. So it is important that we look at these principles and the purposes as something of a need to unite the continent in terms of its postgraduate qualifications, its qualifications in general. The ACQSF is best understood as part of Africa's broader integration agenda, alongside free movement, trade, cooperation, skills development. Therefore, the ACQF is a form of infrastructure of the African knowledge system. It supports mobility, recognition, transparency, and supports the transparency in the regional national qualifications frameworks, as we will discuss as well. It does all of this, and these principles and the purposes are very important in this regard, without eroding sovereignty of individual systems. We know this is a problem, because sometimes when you say in this country we do this, you hear said it can't be done in our country because the government has more control over the regulatory control over quality and the NQF, whereas in others institutions seem to have more controls over some of the regulations or some of the curriculum or educational academic decisions. So there are varying differences and in the different contexts within the African continent, within the sub-regions of the African continent. The instrument itself coordinates as much as possible without taking control from the individual states, from the individual system. So embedded in the ACQS and as well as in its purposes and principle is this idea that you must enhance openness, transparency, cooperation, mobility, without eroding the sovereignty of individual system. There must be some level of coordination. It is really important that we look at this instrument not necessarily as a political instrument, as an NQF that has at its core political foundations for the broader integration of the African continent. And we will see this as we proceed generally, that this really is the intention. Whether it does so successfully is a different matter that we may be able to discuss. The point here that's being made is this relationship between the national qualifications frameworks with the regional qualifications framework, as well as the ACQSF. I chose this particular imagery because I thought this one closely represents the idea that this is not a hierarchical relationship between these three instruments. It's more of a translation hierarchy than it is a hierarchy of importance or power. Whereas you have at the very core of the system, the NQFs. In this country, we have a very mature NQF. It's currently undergone or is still undergoing some revisions, as is any instrument that has been there for a while, to keep it updated, to keep it competitive and comparable to other similar systems across the world. Followed by that, you have regional qualification frameworks. Now, Africa is divided into regions. As we all know, you have the East African Community, you have the SADC, you have West Africa, you have Central Africa, and so forth. And each of those sub-regions, if you may call them, or regions, if you may call them, it tends to develop its own instruments to coordinate the member states and the systems of those member states in that area. Ours in the SADC region is SAQUAN, the Southern African Qualifications Agency, Quality Agency Network. It coordinates the different quality agencies across the region. Again, this is something we must be familiar with because there's a lot of discussion that are taking place in that space that we need to know, which ultimately will affect us in this country, but also there are different regions whose conversations will affect them in their different spaces. And then you have ultimately the ACQF, which really is about coordinating mobility beyond the region, beyond just different individual countries. It coordinates mobility of movement, the enhancement of the skills and the economy of the continent as a whole. It really wants to integrate the continent as a single entity in similar ways that you would find in other regions, such as in Europe, where students do not necessarily struggle moving from one system to the other based on their qualifications, because it's generally well recognized across the board. Now, although our conversation today is not a conversation about the referencing guide, we will speak about the referencing a bit so that you see how these connect and where the disconnects are before we touch on the implications for the postgraduate education. Again, this is continuation of what I spoke about earlier, the relationship between the national, regional, and continental instruments. The ACQSF does not replace national frameworks. Instead, it allows qualifications from different systems to speak to each other and to really enhance each other in terms of compatibility, where one system can learn from the other in the development of those systems, but in the continuous enhancement of those systems. It is about ensuring that the regulators that are responsible for the national systems, the regional systems, retain their sovereignty, but at the same time, they're fully aware of the implications of the decisions that they take in their own individual spaces on the students as they graduate with qualifications at a continental level. So the goal is really comparability. It's not standardization. As you can see from here, the national frameworks remain the regulatory home of qualifications in the different jurisdictions. Regional frameworks act as bridges across the systems in the region, and the ACQSF takes a wider view on the continent and looks at what is done elsewhere in Europe, in Asia, in South America, that will allow for the skills and qualifications to be recognized beyond the African continent. I mentioned earlier that although we're not going to be touching on the referencing per se, we will look at some of the examples of referencing. There is a whole instrument or set of instruments on the referencing on the ACQF, which I'm not equipped to deliver today, but at least it will give us an idea of how that works. So referencing links national qualification levels to ACQSF level descriptors, and we'll speak about the level descriptors in a moment. It builds mutual trust across the systems, it supports recognition and portability, and strengthens international credibility. Because of a present of a national qualifications framework, international systems are able to understand exactly what sort of skills and competencies to expect from a person who holds a particular qualification, because they would have met what is considered as the standard based on the level of the qualification. There are four referencing criteria for the ACQF, which really demonstrate a link between national levels and the ACQF descriptors. And those level descriptors are what we consider the NQF. When you look at the NQF, you want to know what are the level descriptors which are expressed as learning outcomes in many of these systems per level, which should be obtained by the candidate in that particular level. Transparent qualification procedures and registers. Again, we do find that as we move across the African continent, sometimes it's very difficult for you to understand the standards linked to a qualification and decisions made per qualification, and what the qualification type actually entails in a specific space. We're moving into a more transparent, more compatible system, but it is difficult at times to understand exactly what the outcomes at a particular level are in a specific jurisdiction that will allow you to then apply issues of credit accumulation and transfer, recognition of prior learning, and the alternative pathways that we speak of as particularly crucial in the 21st century and the challenges that we are facing. Also, a key criteria is the quality assurance of the different instruments. The ACQF emphasizes quality assurance, that you not only must have them in place, you must be clear and transparent on how these are applied, who is responsible for the application of these across the board. The NQFs that are controlled by the national bodies are expected to pronounce very clearly on what the quality assurance arrangements are for the different levels and for the instruments as a whole. So this criteria is crucial in understanding postgraduate education across the board, as we're going to see. So in terms of design, you realize that, particularly if you're familiar with the South African National Qualifications Framework, that you begin to see similar things in the ACQF in terms of its design. But you also have to understand that the NQF in the South African case, and in some other cases as well, East Africa, and you find some of it in West Africa as well, is similar to other NQFs across the globe. So this parity and similarity is not about standardization, but it is really about ensuring that we are in line with what happens at a national, a regional, and a continental level. So it's meta qualifications framework, the ACQF. It looks at the broader NQFs and RQFs to ensure that there's alignment across the board. It is based on 10 levels, which are a continuum of qualifications for education and training systems. Again, you realize in East Africa, you have one that is also based on 10 levels. In Southern Africa, the regional qualifications also is based on 10 levels. But then if you go to individual countries, you find that the levels are different. Some have 8 levels and some have 10 levels. There is one system, I forget what it is, that had 11 levels in terms of its NQF, each with this descriptor on what is expected as an achievement, as an outcome. There are 4 domains, or at least 3 main domains here that we will be looking at. It's knowledge, skills, autonomy, and responsibility. Again, if you're looking at the NQFs, you'd find that first it says it describes the level, the expected knowledge at a particular level and skills at that level, and then the level of autonomy and responsibility that is expected as an outcome in that particular space. So it is in fact a comprehensive and inclusive instrument, which includes all modes of learning, all levels across the board, from 1 to 10, in some instances, that's a regional or national level. You will find less or more. But at the ACQF level, there is 1 until 10, similar to the South African National Qualifications Framework. I've already touched that the level descriptors are expressed as learning outcomes, which we're really familiar with. And then there's also the centrality of quality and quality assurance. Learning outcomes orientation supports improved transparency and comparability of qualifications of different national systems. Transparency and credibility, RPL, and validation of outcomes from experience, access to quality, RPL. Recognition of prior learning is still an instrument that we're grappling with, where some institutions do it differently from others. Although there are policy guidelines, we're still not following it uniformly across the board. Again, this is recognition of institutional autonomy. It's recognition of the lack of parity across the system as well. But we are trying to get to a point where RPL becomes a path for students, for graduates, that is an alternative to your normal pathway, and it also becomes easier across the board and is not used as an impediment. This is also similar to the credit accumulation and transfer systems, where it still is a question of trust in the system. On the one hand, you find that a student with a qualification from a particular system or particular institution is trusted to have a more quality qualification than a student of a similar level qualification, but from a different system as a whole. So there is a lack of parity, a lack of trust. And so you want to get to a point where you're able to say the system has reached a level of maturity, still with the level of flexibility, and also still allowing for individual decisions and sovereignty where it is important to be respected. But the idea is to promote access, to improve access, lifelong and life-wide learning without any undue bureaucratic and political impediments on the learners. So referencing itself should be understood as confidence building exercise, not a ranking mechanism. And sometimes we think, when you look at this level against that level in different systems, you are ranking the quality aspect of this. You are not. You just want to see where to locate a particular qualification within your own relevant national qualification framework. So it's not really a ranking mechanism. So countries demonstrate the reliability of their frameworks, signaling maturity and maturing partners in the long haul. So over time, the signaling can influence students' flows. It can promote research, particularly collaborative research across the continent, research partnerships across systems, where in some cases it is difficult to collaborate because of these impediments, political impediments, sometimes financial, but mostly perceptual, where we think things are not really of the same quality, and therefore you can't collaborate for research that would actually benefit the continent as a whole. And also it would, in some instances, enhance institutional reputation. It may also negatively affect institutional reputation as well as systems reputation. So on the domains of learning, we have knowledge, which we spoke about, skills, autonomy, and responsibility. So the ACPF contains 10 levels, each referencing learning outcomes across formal, non-formal, and informal contexts. Descriptors show how knowledge, skills, and autonomy increase in breadth and complexity across the board. And these domains of learning are very critical in understanding how this is then understood across the board. So when you speak about knowledge, you have to understand the depth, the breadth, and the application of those knowledges across the different levels, and how they increasingly get more complex, more challenging as the levels increase, but also how they are connected, because they cannot be disconnected. Similarly to the skills, issues of cognitive, digital innovation, and practical and social skills are part of what is considered important in the learning domains. And the higher you go, particularly for postgraduate studies, you want to see autonomy and responsibility, and this is emphasized in the ACQF. You will find that this is emphasized across the board with the national qualification frameworks, the regional qualification frameworks, even in the ones that are still in development or the ones that have just started recently to be implemented. You will see this is very, very critical to understand how the NQFs promotes increasingly complex learning and skills and knowledges across the board. So what we're considering at this stage is where postgraduate studies are located across the ACQF, in comparison to the regional qualifications frameworks and the national qualifications frameworks. I have extracted a few here as an example. I thought to highlight all 10 would be a waste of time given the audience here who is familiar with the NQFs and how NQFs work. In particular, I want you to focus on the level 9 and 10, where level 9 is the mastery at the forefront of a discipline, and level 10 is original contribution extending disciplinary frontiers. This sounds quite similar to where we locate level 10 qualifications, and level 10 qualifications for the ACQF, much like the NQF, much like the SADC QF, is a doctoral education, which includes professional doctoral education as well. So you can immediately see that you can locate your level to and compare it and reference it against the continental level, against the regional level. In Kenya, for example, you will see that they also have similar compatibility across the board. So the doctoral studies being the highest level in terms of the NQF. Now, I went further to just give you an example of the level descriptors, as well as look at the different regional qualification frameworks. You will see here some of the differences. The EQF, which I believe is the Eastern Qualifications framework. I may not necessarily be remembering the acronyms correctly. There are 8 levels where the doctoral studies are located at level 8. Whereas with the others, the doctoral studies are located at level 10. So the PRQS is level 10. There's also a comparison with the South American instruments where some of them are located at 10. But on the continent, you'll see most regional frameworks are located at 10 levels, with the doctoral studies being at level 10. Now, those who are located at level 8 does not necessarily mean that they're of poor quality. This is not a quality comparison. It's a way in which the knowledge has been structured, a way in which the outcomes have been placed according to each level. When you do an actual reference exercise, you might see that level 8 is actually linked to not just level 10, but also level 9 and 10, depending on the level of complexity that they're engaging with. So some levels have been bundled together because the outcomes seem to be similar to the extent that they can be considered in one level. It's the way in which the systems have been designed historically. It's not a question of quality or compatibility. It's a question of when you look at a person from that jurisdiction whose NQF or RQF is at level 8, at an African continental level, that level 8 is in fact compatible with level 10, and therefore it should be possible for that person to move almost seamlessly across the systems because there is a way to compare them and to reference them. The problem is when you can't locate the levels because you don't know what the instruments that was used to determine the level is. To take it a step further, I'm giving you some examples here. I've stolen this data from the learning instruments that developed by the team that is responsible for the ACQF on the continent. You will see here when you go to level referencing compatibility as an example. This is not something that we should take to heart, but just so you see how the system is designed. The levels of the ACQF are on the far left of your screen, and then you will see the different countries and how those NQFs in those countries match up against the ACQF. In Southern Africa, for example, you will see that almost all of our NQF have level 10s, and then you might find some differences here and there, but mostly they have level 10s. You will see some difference in the Zambian case, where in level 2, for example, there is 2A and 2B. Again, it is described in the Zambian NQF what the difference between the learning outcomes on 2A and 2B are, which will then tell you how the system is configured. But for the most part, the Southern African systems are very much in line with the ACQF level. I am not saying that the ACQF was simply adapted from the Southern African Regional Qualifications Framework or the NQF of South Africa. No, but we will discuss actually some of the challenges associated with the development of a continental instrument or regional instrument across the board, because we didn't start at that level. You started at that national level and then to the regional and the continent, and therefore there will be some implications of the process on what the final outcome and the final feel and look of the continental instrument is. You then see some outside the SADC region, the Kenyan example, again, 10 levels, Cabo Verde, 8 levels. Now, this data was from some time ago. The levels may have changed because I know that some of these jurisdictions were still working on their NPFs and updating them at some point. So the data may have changed. But as an example of how each NQF can be looked at in relation to the ACQF is very important for us to understand. So the implications for postgraduate education, in my view, and this is my view, you may quote me on this as a person, but do not quote me as a system. And please feel free to challenge my view here. The level descriptors emphasizing mastery, originality, and theory building position doctoral education as a continental strategic resource rather than solely a national credential. It can be argued that it is not a continental resource, it is not a national resource, it is an individual resource. But I would beg to differ because of where the level of knowledge is pitched, and the originality of that knowledge and the contributions expected of a person who's studying a postgraduate degree, who has a qualification that is considered level 8, level 9, and what sort of contributions they're expected to have on society. And so for me, if it is at a level, postgraduate level, it is not just good for the individual, it is good for society in the immediate jurisdiction of that individual in the region as well as in the continents, particularly when you're promoting skills mobility, transference, the building of the African economy and the sustainability of that, and the globalization consideration there. You might even extend it beyond the African continent, that it's good for the broader global community. I had a very peculiar but quite illuminating discussion at some point with a former colleague who was making a point that what is the point of a PhD if a person does not use that PhD to advance society in one form or the other, either through community work or the quality of his or her work, or publication of research, or community engagement, whatever the case may be. What is the value of the PhD if it is just for the title? Because there are a number of people who do PhDs and ultimately obtain them simply because they haven't found employment, or because they just want the title. So there must be an assessment according to this person of, you've obtained your PhD, what have you done that is commensurate to your PhD? So a post-assessment of PhD, and according to this person, you must lose the PhD if after a while you haven't done anything that supports the qualification to benefit society more broadly. So that's really the implication for postgraduate education across the continent. And if postgraduate education, particularly doctoral studies, is a continental imperative, it's a resource for the continent, then we must say that doctoral studies is compatible across the board. In one region or the other, that the quality is similar. It can be considered that if you have a PhD from the University of Nene in Neneville country, Republic, that's similar in every shape or form to a person from the University of Sanele in Sanele Republic, where the benevolent dictator lives. But the quality of education is the same, because the NQF promotes and actually ensures this, and there's quality assurance associated with this. Secondly, the recognition of learning outcomes supports increased cross-border academic movement. We've touched on on this point about collaborative research, where it's difficult, even on the African continent, to collaborate across borders for a number of reasons, but mostly because of lack of trust, and funding, but lack of trust. Now, if you create trust in the system, that you can compare systems, and we have perfectly reasonable expectations that a particular person from a particular country's qualification is of the highest esteem comparable to any other system. Funding may then be able to follow, because when the academic system is trusting, then the funders can also trust that the system knows that it works well, it is seamless, there's proper alignment across the board. And so you can expect growth in joint doctorates, in joint supervisions across the region, in regional research networks, and the growth of regional research networks and collaboration, including collaboration across universities on the African continent. So that's really one of the values, some of the values of a continental qualifications framework, regional qualifications framework in relation to the national qualifications frameworks. Further, quality assurance is fundamental trust and mobility, as I said, of qualifications. But the challenge is the more you have the alignment based on the NQFs, the RQFs, as well as the continental instrument, you will then face ultimately increased scrutiny, particularly on doctoral supervision, on doctoral studies, examination, and research outputs, because these are resource incentive. And if you don't really consider the resource implications here, you might have some challenges. So there will be increased scrutiny as soon as there's this alignment. It is not a bad thing to increase scrutiny, but it might be a challenge for those systems that are still in development, that are still trying to find resources to support quality postgraduate education. The support for credit transfers suggests potential expansion of structured and flexible doctoral pathways incorporating coursework and transferable skills. This again is a positive thing. It might also be something of a challenge. How you structure the postgraduate doctoral studies is still a matter of debate. Whether some systems would accept, for example, coursework as part of the doctoral studies, or doctoral studies is simply high intense, high level research that doesn't require any form of coursework. I know that there is a move to have a balanced, more flexible doctoral studies, but in other jurisdictions, it's not really there. So these are some of the issues that we need to consider as implications of the ACQF going forward, because although it doesn't force anything on national systems and regional systems, it does have an influence on those systems in terms of expectations. In terms of the ACQF qualifications platform will be published with information on national qualifications, strengthening visibility, portability, and transparency. Now, if that's the case, and if the ACQF successfully does that, there is implications on the reputation of individual systems and regions. It is a good thing, but it may also be a challenging thing for those systems that are still in development, because although they will be placed then not as a comparison of the system is poor, the system is not, the implications would be for a person who's just reading that because this system seems to be having challenges here, or is not seen to be at the same level there, it means it is of poor quality, when in fact that's not necessarily the case. So as we look at the SUQF, we have to consider context. Context has to play a part here, but the implications of publishing information of national qualifications at a continental level may, if done incorrectly or done in a way that does not provide a clear explanation, remove the contextual considerations that are critical of NQFs across the board, as well as the regional qualifications frameworks that arise through the combination of the NQFs in a specific region. Referencing facilitate recognition, but does not replace national legislation or standardized systems. This preserves diversity while enabling collaboration. It is important, I think, in this way to emphasize the role of individual systems and jurisdictions in terms of their political maturity. You can have a very good NQF, but if the political system is not enabling of certain things, that NQF suffers because it can't be applied, it can't be developed in a way that promotes what the ACQF seeks to promote and what the regional frameworks seeks to promote, and therefore issues of collaboration may still be affected. So the qualifications frameworks are not immune to political interference, to political regulatory stumbling blocks. In fact, they may very well be one of those things that are heavily influenced by the level of political maturity in the different systems. If one system is a more democratic system, and the way that the level of the level descriptors are created and the expectations of those would be different from a system that may not necessarily be democratic in nature, and how the level descriptors are then considered, and the NQFs will feel and look differently, and their purposes may be different. So context and respecting individual context is really important. At the same time, understanding that the continent is very diverse in terms of political maturity. It will take a long time to get to, if we want to get to the level of European system where things move relatively better, because the systems are relatively similar in nature, shared values, and so forth. So I've already mentioned this as part of the implication, some of the strategic risks, but I thought it might be worth repeating them here. The first one is it's a major one for me, but it may not necessarily be something that some of us consider as important. There will be perceived equivalence or non-equivalence of qualifications, particularly postgraduate qualifications, even in the context of uneven research capacities. Research, as we spoke about, is resource intensive. It doesn't matter what type of research, there are resources that are required for that research. Now, if we use the qualifications frameworks irresponsibly or loosely, you might create a situation where you think the equivalence in terms of the NQFs suggest equivalence of research capacity, and therefore you might not really consider some of the individual challenges that different systems face in research, and how it will be difficult to obtain a particular qualification at a postgraduate level in one jurisdiction compared to another because of what you might not have access to. And so this is one thing that we really should take into account in understanding the CQF and applying it in a manner that does not inadvertently disadvantage certain jurisdictions. The more aligned the systems are, the more certain systems, because of their resources and reputation, create or attract more by way of students than others. It's just the way things are. You might not say that, well, the system, all the systems are aligned, all the NQFs are aligned, and as well as the ACQF ensures that there's proper alignment and level of mobility, and therefore students are not going to be mobile. It is likely to promote more mobility when a person with a master's degree realizes that that master's degree is going to be easily recognized and accredited by a different system that looks more attractive than theirs. They will try to move. And so some students have this particular impediment currently, that their postgraduate qualification is not easily recognized by other systems on the continent, and therefore they can't go anywhere except to continue in that system. If there is increased mobility, there is increased pressure on supervision. Already there is increased pressure on some systems on postgraduate supervision. South Africa is not immune to this, and I think some countries in the region, as well as the Eastern region, are not really immune to this, where there is really a shortage of supervisors because of the high demand at a postgraduate level. And so this is something that is a risk. Is it a good enough risk to not have an ACQF? I don't think so. But it is one that we should plan for in the promotion of the ACQF itself, and the integration and enhancement of the African continent's economic positioning. The increased reporting complexity comes with any new instrument. But this reporting complexity will not necessarily affect everyone in the system, but it will affect the quality agencies. It will affect those who are responsible for programs and qualifications at institutional level. Not always, but in some instances. And so we must be mindful of this, because not only do you now speak of the alignment with the NQF, you then must speak about the NQF's alignment with the regional QF, as well as the regional alignments, regional QF's alignment to the continental QFs. And somebody must be responsible for this and ensure that there's continuous alignment across the board to promote this mobility that we seek to promote. So there's increased reporting complexity there. We spoke about, to some extent, the normative continental expectations. What should be achieved in one jurisdiction should be equally achieved in another jurisdiction, even though the lived experience suggests that it's not necessarily possible, at least at this stage in a maturing African continent that is still very poor in a number of areas, and still comes from different political, ideological sort of perceptions and strengths, and some of the difficulties arise from the inability of governments to support the education system, or vice versa, where the education system does not seem to be promoting in a way that it would to the development of the continent as a whole. There is one point again that I've touched on earlier that I want to repeat here, and perhaps more emphatically. If you recall, I did say those of us who are familiar with the South African NQF might look at the ACQF and say, nah, as my son will say, meh. It looks familiar. It looks like something I've seen before. And that's because you have seen it through the NQF, the South African NQF, through the regional qualifications framework of the SADC region, as well as the other regions. In the development of the NQF, of the ACQF, they took into account what the different NQFs that exists say, and what they look like, what they feel like, how are they constructed in relation to how other NQFs across the world are constructed. And you will then see that some of the more mature NQFs have influenced almost disproportionately the ACQF, such that it actually reads almost the same as the NQFs that you are familiar with. And so what this means is that when you develop continental instruments and you start from a national level to the regional level to the continental level, there is some dominant risk that's going to arise there, that those systems that are mature might find better representation in those voices, because their systems are said to be mature, and their systems are benchmarked a bit more than others. In the African continent, there are countries that are used for benchmarking more than others. And there are systems that are considered to have been better developed. Not that they are better in terms of quality, but they are better developed, they're more mature. They've been in existence for a while, and they've considered quite a number of factors in their existence. Those systems tend to then find their voices expressed better in continental instruments. So the ACQF might also suffer that. I'm not saying this is the case, but I'm saying it might suffer that, where you read different aspects of it and you realize that you've seen this, you've heard of this, because you've seen it in the NQF or the regional qualification framework. And then the issue around the decontextualization of qualification frameworks is also very important. NQFs must take into account the context for which they were developed. But in this increasingly interconnected and interdependent world, in the continent, those cannot isolate the regional demands as well as the continental demands. Balancing all of those while still respecting the context of the individual countries is a very difficult task. And that is why in some instances you find it difficult to implement regional and continental instruments, because it seems like they're an imposition on your system, even though they take into account your system. So there is a risk that at some point, without proper coordination, without proper communication, regional and continental instrument may be perceived to be decontextualizing NQFs as a whole, and the sort of decontextualizing and removing the very nature and the purpose of having an NQF in the first place. And why does a country need an NQF when you have regional one, and when you have a continental one? Why just use one instrument and then you be done with it? So those are some of the complexities that I think we have to keep in mind when we look at the ACQF, especially when we're looking at doctoral education. But from where I sit, the idea of ensuring that postgraduate education across the continent is recognized equally is very, very important, because you don't want to have a PhD in one country for it to not be recognized in another country because it doesn't meet the certain outcomes that are expected of a PhD or a level 10 qualification. So lastly, colleagues, I just want to state the following. The ACPF is not merely a framework, it is a scaffolding for an African knowledge system. It really seeks to promote a a wealth of knowledge coordination on the African continent, knowledge production, knowledge dissemination on a continental scale. It is dependent on different NQFs and dependent on the different regional qualifications frameworks, but at its core, it seeks to really promote the African continent as a knowledge hub across the world, so that it is respected as an equal player compared to other global system. So its deepest influence will likely occur at postgraduate level, where knowledge is produced and innovation originates. Again, this is where the space we're playing in, where we really want to ensure that knowledge production, and we speak about issues of decolonization, Africanization of the curriculum and all those, you need an instrument that supports that. And an ACQF at the continental level needs to support that, just to protect the graduates going forward in terms of the parity of the qualifications that they offer. The ACQF positions postgraduate education in Africa as on par with global standards. If you're looking at the European instruments qualifications framework, and you look at other instruments, you would see that in fact it's on the same level, at least on paper. On the ground, implementation may be different, but on paper it is on the same level. That's because it was intentionally to be so, designed to be so. It might as a result suffer from it looking at least too European and less African, and that it might not necessarily be completely contextually relevant for the African continent, given the African continent's complexity and vastness in terms of geography. That accusation might be a sound accusation, but on paper, the quality is on par with what we see across the globe. And by the way, for those of us who are familiar with this, the more you travel across the world and you look at systems, the more you realize actually our systems are not too far behind. In some instances, they are good, better than others. But there's this perception that it's a dark continent, everything that stays dark, and therefore the quality is also in darkness, so to speak. So it really is something that promotes education on the African continent in the way that it can as a qualifications framework. And so the strategic question for me is no longer whether the systems will align, because it's not really the question now. I think we're all moving in that direction, but it is linked to the risk that I identified earlier. Who or what will shape the terms of alignment? It's a question I cannot answer, but it is a risk, particularly for postgraduate education. What do we define as an acceptable level descriptor and as acceptable skill level competence for a person who holds a doctoral degree? And is that a neutral position? Is it a politically influenced position? Is it a historical one? Does it take into account the different conditions that exist and contexts within the African continent? Or is it something that can be achieved by every jurisdiction in the continent, regardless of its economic resources and its political governance system? So those are the things that I would really want to highlight today, so that when we speak about postgraduate education in relation to national qualification frameworks, regional qualifications frameworks, and the African continental qualifications framework, we look at what they're meant to do, what their implications are on postgraduate education, and whether this is something we are comfortable with or whether this is something we think is taking us back in terms of context. Thank you very much, colleagues. That is my 2 cents for today. I hope I did not bore you too much. Thank you.
Dear Dr. Nene, dear Sanele, thank you so much. Sue has just dropped off a little bit, I see. So she asked me to take over. Thank you so much for your insightful discussion and talk this afternoon. I have about 5 or 6 questions listed from my side, but of course there are more people, and I hope you will give us the opportunity for some Q&A now. I can invite people with questions to either write them in the chat or just raise your virtual hand and open your mic for any questions to Dr. Nene. And I see the hands flying up. Professor Burton, Stephanie, can I give you the floor first?
Thank you very much. And Sanele, thank you so much for a really informative presentation. It has made me think about a lot of things, but I wanted to ask you a fairly simple question, or 2 questions actually. The first is, to what extent do you see the professional doctorate becoming more predominant as a result of this kind of framework? Do you think that a professional doctorate will be more accepted or more common as a result of this? And the second part of that is related, and that is, to what extent does the framework address perhaps technicalities, but around coursework and assessment and the actual mechanisms for operating doctoral degrees particularly? So that's my questions. Let me stop there and listen to what you think.
Thank you very much, Prof. I'm not sure if you would prefer me to address each question or perhaps take a round of questions.
What would you
That's
prefer?
up to you.
What would you prefer? Would you like to take a round?
Yeah, I think it would be, I think that might be preferred.
Okay, no problem. Who else can I give the floor? Are there any other questions? I'm just scrolling down. I see a hand. Mr. Grief, Jappie? Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you for a very informative session tonight. This is definitely interesting, and I think I'm quite positive about these sorts of alignments. I think they actually can add a lot of value. I have a slightly sort of tangent question. We actually have a meeting in the very near future with the Department of Higher Education and Training, as there's a number of BRICS standards that have also been brought forward in terms of curricular standards and alignment with different BRICS countries in terms of qualifications frameworks and finding equivalences. Is this something that is being explored in the Council of Higher Education space as well? Or I just wanted to understand, because this obviously looks at the Africa thing. Are we also looking at the other networks that we are involved in? And is that part of a singular vision, or is it 2 completely separate things and not touching each other?
Thank you, Yapi. There's also a question in the chat from Susan requesting your feedback on how the European qualifications framework is properly aligned and what lessons could there be drawn from this context. So that's a question as well. I'll take one more and then we'll hand over to Sanele. Mr. Watela, please go ahead, unmute.
Thank you very much. I hope I'm audible.
Yes.
Yeah, let me join the rest of my colleagues for such a wonderful and informing presentation. And I know that one of the things you really try to emphasize is that this is not a framework for leveling or trying to figure out which is better than the other. But I keep going back to your slide number 4. That actually tries to show the subsets as well as intersections. And I keep going back to the middle. And I'm now asking myself the question, at least we should be able to describe the bare minimums. One of the things that I've always had with an approach that tries to unite the continent is that despite, and you mentioned it earlier on, knowing very well that most frameworks are in reference to the context, which I respect as well. But most of them actually have problematic aspects to them. And I sometimes feel a little bit uncomfortable to try and join problems until we are very clear and very honest about it, that these are our problems. And one thing I also really, really like that you're brave enough to sort of mention is political interference aspect of it. So the framework is all logical and all nice. But how us as technicians do we deal with the political administrative interface in trying to justify this? Because if I had to summarize your presentation, I think it all borderlines on quality that can actually transition across the continent. So 2 questions there. One, what are the bare minimums? And then secondly, how do we tease out the problematic aspects, or rather the carelessly left aspects of the issues that we want to resolve? Thank you very much. I hope that wasn't too long. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Sanele, please. Would you like me to maybe start with Professor Burton's question on the professional PhD?
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, I expected difficult questions. They're starting to be difficult. To be honest, Prof, I haven't given that any thought until now, and it's worrying that that the thought hasn't occurred to me about whether this will actually, in a way, promote more of the professional doctorates as opposed to our traditional research-based doctorates. I don't know if there's going to be a direct relationship between that and the continental framework, but I do think that the professional doctorate is going to increase because as an alternative pathway to a doctorate. I do think as we consider the doctoral studies and look at the different alternatives towards obtaining a doctoral degree, one of these issues would be how do you professionalize the PhD for some industries where it's not automatically clear that you could, and how do then you promote the doctoral studies through that. So it may increase as a natural byproduct of a discussion on doctoral studies, but whether it would be linked to the national qualifications frameworks, I'm not sure. But certainly through RPL and it certainly would be something that would naturally increase. I have not seen evidence that there is a growth in this particular type of doctoral studies, but I would not be surprised if there is. But at this stage, I think we would have to give it some thoughts and maybe do a bit of backwork on understanding whether there is, in fact, a link between a qualifications framework and a professional doctoral degree. Much like other qualifications framework, the issue of assessment is at the core of the NQF, because the assessment has to be at a level expected of that level. So if you're looking at the skills component, the competency component, you will read the different NQFs and you'd see that they do emphasize, particularly when you emphasize quality assurance, that the assessment must be pitched at the right level. So I think the ACQF follows in the same way, although it may not speak to it in directly the same way that the NQF does, but it does say that the level of assessment, the conditions of assessment, at least more broadly, have to be commensurate with the level at which the qualification is pitched. The higher you go in the level descriptors, the more complex the knowledge, the competencies, the more complex the assessment and the learning and teaching and all the different academic set of experiences that are expected of that level. And so it's not really devoid of it. I think it promotes it, but it has to speak to it at a much higher level, at a continental level, which is slightly different from what you would see at an NQF level. These really have to speak to each other. So I think it covers it. We may argue whether it covers it sufficiently, and if we do so, we may argue at whether the NQFs actually cover this component sufficiently as well. The projects that the department is leading, and some of the discussions that the departments are leading on the networks themselves, the CHE is not particularly leading those, but we are participating in many of them. We were, for example, if you're looking at the development of the ACQF, the development of the SADC, the regional qualifications framework, and others, and other similar initiatives, we do get invited to those either by the Department of Higher Education and Training or by the different entities at a regional level, at a continental level, and some within the country itself. So you might find there's representation there, but there is no project currently that I'm aware of. I'm subject to correction here, where we're leading the discussions along the same lines that Prof raised earlier, but we are part of the discussions with the DHET and some of its projects. In terms of the alignment of the European qualifications framework, Europe is very interesting because it is a small continent, and so and it's a fairly economically well developed continent, and some of these things are easier to implement. It's also, in terms of only systems, much older than many of our systems. Africa is a very young continent, and so there is very clear alignment across the different regions of Europe, not all, but many of them, in terms of the European qualifications framework, and they're very mature quality assurance systems and NQFs as well. But if you're looking at the European qualifications framework and its alignment across the board, and you're looking at ours, at least on paper, it's pretty similar. But we know that in terms of implementation, we're slightly younger, still learning, and we're learning from them, and we hope that at some point they're also learning from us. But it is fairly well aligned. It does not mean that there are no challenges. There are challenges, and some of those challenges are really not at an NQF level. They're at a political level, where we promote integration. Some countries are facing a de-integration, or I'm not sure what the correct term is here. You do get the political noise that really is against integration, and so they will suffer that in a number of places. But I'm not yet aware of a successful case of an NQF that has been dismantled in Europe, or regional qualifications framework, or the European one, that has been challenged or dismantled successfully as a result of a change of political scenery in those jurisdictions. So we may use it as a benchmark reliably without using it as a controlling mechanism, because we have our own here. The NQF expresses the bare minimums. The level outcomes, the level descriptors are about the bare minimum, what should be expected in terms of competencies, in terms of skills, the level of independence and responsibility. Those are bare minimums. And the ACQF also does the same, because what would be the maximum? And that would be a debatable question if we were to enter that. So it is best to express a bare minimum, and these instruments do express a bare minimum. The problem is whether the bare minimum is fair, whether the bare minimum is just given the contextual diversity within the African continent. It's a question I cannot necessarily answer, but it's a question that I think could be answered. Despite and in spite of resources, there must be something that all jurisdictions should be able to achieve if they are to play in the higher education space. If you are to successfully be a higher education provider, a system that provides higher education and a quality assurance agency or instrument at a national level, you must be able to say at least a holder of a specific qualification must be able to do this. Otherwise, I think you're in the wrong industry. You should be doing something else. And so the NQFs express the bare minimum. Again, we might ask if in fact those are bare or those are actually fair. It's a different question. I do not have an answer, Prof, unfortunately, of what we can do to shield ourselves or to minimize the impact of the political changes and the political impediments, except to try and influence those themselves. So at best, NQF is one that is founded in the legislation supported by government. So if you're going to have a national qualifications framework, the law must actually compel it, that you must have this. That way, regardless of who becomes or takes power, they will still need to deal with the law if they want to challenge the NQF itself. And so the more you formalize the establishment and the importance of an NQF, the better it is for its insulation from political interference. You will still find political interference, but I don't know how exactly we would be able to stop that, except to not exist as a neutral party, to understand that we are not as a system neutral. We have to fight for what we think is right, particularly in protecting the quality and the imperatives of society, immediate society, regional and continental one. So academics, the administrators, university managers, all of us who are in higher education, particularly in postgraduate education, must emphasize the need of independence, curriculum independence, autonomy, maybe let me use the right word, autonomy, to ensure that we are able to produce the type of knowledge that is going to drive the continent forward and going to drive the economy of the continent forward. That is the best I think we can do under the circumstances. I don't know how else we would be able to fight the system to protect the NQFs themselves. I think those are the questions I have so far. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nene. Yeah, no, I think it's a very, very important discussion, and also to look at the ACQF as a tool for comparing systems rather than making them look the same. That being said, you also raised that issue in your last slide about how can it become more African, because it looks a little bit European at the moment. What are your thoughts about that? Because I've met you a few times and I'm quite sure you have thought about what that could be. So that would be my question. I'm also looking at other colleagues. Are there any more questions? There's a remark from Sue about how she hopes that this will resolve battles with SACRA about students from the rest of Africa not having honors. Oh my dear, I totally fully get that, because I'm also involved in one of those mobility projects on the African continent where South Africa puts itself outside the discussion for receiving master students just because they don't have the honors degree. So that's a huge bump for many of these projects. But will this enhance opportunities for solidarity of African higher education against lack of recognition by Global North or some African qualifications? That's what Sue is raising. Anybody else with questions? I'm just looking through the chat. And no other questions. May I then hand over back to you again, Sanele? I'm sorry for all the questions that are being fired at you.
No, that's fine. I think that's part of the conversation. Some of the questions are actually making us think as well, because we need to think about even the role of the CHE in all of this, and the individual roles of the individual players in the sector. Those are important questions that we need to engage with. The issue of the honors degree, it's difficult because even in our own NQF, in the South African case, the honors is not necessarily the only way you get to a master's degree. We consider the credits, for example, where you say a particular degree at a particular level is 360 credit, or for 80 credits, and if a qualification has this number of credits at a bachelor's level, then it means the next level in terms of progression is in fact a master's qualification. So our own instrument allows for this when you're looking at credits and the level of knowledge that is expected from those credits. So it should be possible using the NQF, the Regional Qualifications Framework, and the Continental one to account for the gap in the honors provision across the continent, where some jurisdictions have an honors degree, some do not have an honors degree. If you consider what we started with when we showed that some jurisdictions have 8 levels and some have 10, as long as you are able to say this particular person from this jurisdiction has a qualification that is pitched at the level that would otherwise be considered an honors degree for us, and therefore can access master's degree, I don't think that should be a problem. In fact, the ACKF seeks to do precisely that just look at the referencing, look at what in that jurisdiction this qualification is considered at, the knowledge and the expertise, the experience, the competence, what this person is supposedly expected to have by way of these things at that level, and look at whether it matches what you have at an equivalent level for yourself, even if it's not the same. And then the person should be able to access the master's degree. Of course, it remains an issue because some of us want to see honors on the certificate, and if it's not there, we don't think there is an equivalence there. But if you're looking at it more carefully, you really realize actually you can pull out these things if you're considering it. Sometimes we consider this application for purposes of excluding them, as opposed to accepting and creating more access. So that's really sometimes what is happening. So the ACQF is minimizing that, because now you have less grounds to simply exclude a person simply because you don't see a particular wording in the certificate and you think it's not there. If you take the instrument, use the instrument, and you locate the person the same way that they need to be located. So that would be my response to this question about the honors degree. It also is supposed to help the recognition of African qualifications or qualifications from the global south by the global north. However, the lack of recognition of the qualifications sometimes is not a question of qualifications or education. It is a simple question of historical discrimination that requires a different sort of space. One of the ways in which we can really deal with this perception is to increase the quality of our research. And if we increase the quality of our research, we cannot be ignored. China has successfully done this, where Chinese universities are actually now becoming, some of the best according to the rankings, if we believe in the rankings. And if you're looking at the quality of their research, again, if you believe in the assessment in that space, you see that they've increased. So some systems cannot be ignored simply because they're working towards improving the quality of what they produce as well. So I think that's one way of addressing the challenges of recognition of global South qualifications by the global North. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We're coming to a closure. I just have one more question, maybe from my side, because I'm a practical person in project management, and I'm just wondering the time span of implementing the ACQF. What are we looking at? What is your feeling? What is your information on how far this is? When will it Will it be implemented? What steps do you think are really necessary for it to be implemented?
It's already in place. So this is
Okay.
something that we should already be implementing. It's just that as a sector, we need to engage with it more. We need a bit more advocacy around this. And so I really appreciate this platform, because then we're beginning to talk about such things, because the instrument is already in place and it has been for some time. It's just that we are not familiar with it. Because there are a lot of activities that are happening at a continental level that we're not really privy to, because our NQF, particularly in South Africa, seems to be stable and it serves as a benchmark. It's not the only one that is good, but it serves as a benchmark. And so we tend to think ours is one to look at, and a lot of people come to us to benchmark. But let's begin to use these instruments. They're already in place, and we will then use them to create access, better access, and also to ensure that we are able to capitalize on collaborative research across the board.
Wow, thank you. Thank you, Sanele. So do you think the higher education institutions themselves should be the driver of this? Or is it national governments? Is it the African Union, or is it them coming together? How do you see that process?
Yeah. I really do think that the national bodies need to do a better job of marketing these instruments and ensuring that the sector knows about these instruments. Ultimately, the institutions will need to be implementing them, particularly in terms of applications, in terms of ensuring that there is a good understanding for access for students across the African continent to those to the other jurisdiction and into our jurisdictions. So it is something that needs to start, I think, at a national level, cascade down in terms of advocacy and information. But in terms of implementation, institutions will have to implement it on a daily basis, particularly when you recruit students and to deal with some of the challenges that we've experienced before. So it's a collaborative exercise that I think has to be pushed at the national level first, so that institutions know exactly what to do and how to do it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this wonderful, insightful afternoon. I've learned so much, and it gives so much food for thought, and also for the EDE project in which I am involved, of course, which we will continue soon. I think I can speak on behalf of everybody here. Thank you very, very much for your presentation and for the discussion. And hopefully we meet again on this platform sometime soon. Thank you, and have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you very much, Collis, and have a lovely afternoon as well.